Sciences of Strathclyde, and I'm very, very happy to be. So we have three very, very interesting, diverse presentations on the use of novel technology in cultural heritage settings. We're going to start with Stuart Jeffrey, who is a reader in Heritage Visualization at the School of Simulation and Visualization in the Glasgow School of Art. And Stuart is going to be talking about the use of immersives, particularly with a couple of case studies on the digital. I've been practicing how to say this all morning. The Acuon, how to do it properly, and then another one on Fingal's Game. Stuart, I'm going to pass over to you. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Ian. In fact, I'm going to focus almost entirely on the digital Laocoon. I'm saying Laocoon. I've had several years to get used to pronouncing that correctly. It's not that easy. But I'm going to start, I think, in a slightly unusual place to highlight one of the key research themes behind this. And this is looking at this object here, which some of you may recognize. This is it's known as the Utah teapot. It's the very first three-dimensional object that was ever captured in computer graphics by Martin Newell back in the 1970s. It was an entirely digital object, and it's become iconic in computer graphics. It turns up all over the place in 3D modeling packages, as little Easter eggs in various films, Toy Story, and lots of others. But what really struck me about it as being quite interesting is that when we look at how it's treated as a heritage object, if we go to the Computer History Museum, what we discover is that it's the physical teapot that's been ingested into the museum. So the least important point about this object is its physical manifestation. In fact, it is a few lines of code, and it's a true digital object that has an interest and a heritage in its own right. And that's kind of the starting point for this research. And it's not thinking necessarily about the digital heritage objects that we create in reference to the original objects. It's those objects as effective items that have a life and a meaning in their own right. So there's been a lot of research about this, how this might be done, the relationship between a digital replica and its original, and how that replica can become an effective object in its own right. And through the work of people like the Turin Rowe, Fiona Cameron, Sarah Kenderdine, in fact, there's been a lot of elements have been identified that allow a digital object to generate its own value and its own erratic quality. For example, the intentionality of the production. There's a lot made about the quality and the expenditure of resources in that production. But latterly, we've begun to think about the networks of people involved in that production process and how that influences how the object is received in its own right. And there was a couple of projects I was involved in over the last few years, which looked very closely at that by engaging in co-production of digital objects. One was the Accord project, working with about 10 community groups across Scotland, and more recently, Scotland's Rock Art project, where the records of the rock art, almost entirely done through Structure for Motion, are being co-produced with community groups. And there's about 2,500 records that we're dealing with there. But moving on to my main case study, we have, unfortunately, a calamity in 2014. As we know, the Macintosh building of the Glasgow School of Art was quite badly damaged in a fire. Almost immediately after that, well, in fact, absolutely immediately after that, there was a large laser scanning exercise undertaken by SimVis in partnership with Historic Environment Scotland. And the main image there is a cut plane image through that laser scan of the entire building, and you can see most of the damage over there in the right of the image. Almost incidentally to that recording exercise, because we were focused really on the structure of the building to help in its conservation and reconstruction, we caught quite a lot of the objects from within it, including some of the remaining elements of Glasgow School of Art's plaster cast collection. And we can see in the back, I don't know if you can see in the middle of the screen, right at the back, there's a man in obvious pain. That is Laocoon, and that's a plaster cast of this object, this object here. So the Leoquan group was discovered in just outside Rome in about 1506. It became a sensation in art historical terms, and there was a huge number of plaster casts generated of it. Interestingly, the marble version that was uncovered in 1506 is believed to be a copy of an original bronze from the Hellenistic period. So we've got quite an interesting line of extension here, starting with a lost bronze, a marble copy of that bronze, a plaster cast of the marble copy, possibly several generations of plaster cast, and then a digital version of it. So out of the calamity of the fire came an opportunity to work with that digital version. There was a funding call went out via the AHRC and the EPSRC called Memory, Place and Performance, which seemed to fit very much with what we wanted to do with this digital version of the Leoquan. And this was to generate an immersive experience. So the idea was that we'd a user-centered approach, design approach, and we'd co-design and develop the interactive content. So previously we'd be working with co-production and co-design with community groups, now very broad community groups. Now we're looking at communities of interest specifically around the Macintosh and the plaster cast, and this involved staff, students, archivists from the buildings, art historians. Thea Stevens, who we know in the call, was closely involved in this, the architects, and this kind of broader community of interest around the Macintosh and the art school, including the Hunterian Museum. So a lot of the production work was done very closely with ISO Design, commercial SME, who are award-winning through a number of projects, such as our work on the Titanic in Belfast and also Immersives down in Stonehenge. Just as a side note, it's a relatively low budget project, and it was done on relatively short timescales. But the key point is about what we wanted to do. So there's a user-centered linear VR experience that is in itself a creative response. So this was meant for the reopening exhibition of the Macintosh School after it was reconstructed. And the important point is that the object we were creating is specifically an extension of that long biography associated with the Leoquan. It's part of the same story. It doesn't sit separately on its own. And that's why in this context and others, we've been thinking of referring to these types of objects as extended objects, because they extend forward and backwards into the biography of the original. So in this exercise, users are taken through a series of virtual spaces. They encounter quite a lot of rich and diverse content. So this is multi-layered stories that was referred to earlier on. The history of the Leoquan, its role in the Macintosh, the art historical significance of the Leoquan, its damage and the restoration process are extensively documented in this immersive. And it's also self-referencing to the position of the digital replica. So the information about the production of the replica and production of the digital object are incorporated into the object we're producing. So this is an idea of some screenshots for it, and it shows you how we went about doing that. So there's a life-sized Leoquan, which you can walk around and investigate. There's a lot of content which is gaze activated. So essentially, simply by looking at a particular place or looking at a particular element, further information pops up from that. So the user interface was actually quite smooth. And I think an important point to make about this is that calamity on calamity is that after the restoration process of the plaster cast, it was put back into the Macintosh building and unfortunately completely destroyed in the second fire of 2018. So we've got quite an interesting biography developing, starting with the lost bronze original, having multiple iterations of the object, finishing with a creative response, a digital object, which in actual fact is the only remaining step from the plaster cast, which is now no longer with us, is now being destroyed. So I know we don't have a lot of time for this, but I just want to give you a quick flavour of the walkthrough, and then I'll talk about some of the challenges I think we faced with it.
This is Laocoon. Legend has it he was a Trojan priest who, along with his 2 sons, was attacked by sea serpents sent by the gods. The story's most iconic depiction is a marble sculpture from ancient Greece that is now in the Vatican, but many believe to be a copy of an earlier bronze work. You are looking at a plaster replica of the central figure that existed in the Glasgow School of Art's Macintosh building. From the time of its rediscovery, copies of Laocoon and his sons were made in marble and in plaster. Many were used for teaching drawing and anatomy in art schools where collections of casts were wheeled between studios for students to work from.
I'm just going to move on a little bit to have a look at the gaze-activated content around.
And suddenly, the fire had turned them into something completely different again.
So this is now discussing the conservation process that was being undertaken on the fire-damaged original.
The plaster itself. We drilled holes into the Laocoon's body. One was to
3D printing. It can be rendered and textured.
So this is the element towards the end where we're actually talking about the production of the digital replica itself and the affordances that digital replica actually allows us. So there's a YouTube link there which I would encourage people to go and have a look at the walkthrough in full. But I'd like to finish on a few reflections around the experience. First one, I think this has been touched upon already in terms of accessibility and isolation, is that this was a full immersive delivered via an Oculus Rift device, massive shepherding and health and safety issues. People were in an installation situation, people are not allowed on their own to put on a headset, especially a tethered headset, and walk around a space. They need to be observed to do that, simply to stop them from walking into things. So there was some interesting elements of that had to be considered. And kind of in tandem to that is the transitions from physical to virtual modes can be abrupt and dissonant. It's quite a strange experience going from a brightly lit room full of other people, putting on a headset and being plunged into a quite dissonant environment. And that's something I think we should be looking on and working on. I also, and this speaks more to my own personal prejudices, is there's elements of the production of digital heritage objects that we don't manifest fully. For example, authorship. The actual authorship of the creative object, the work of art in essence, are often obscured and corporatized. So they tend to be the production of an organisation, Historic Environment Scotland, Glasgow School of Art, Brightpipe, rather than being attributed to the individuals who are working on it. Not only does this obscure the hand of the artist or the hand of the technician, it also speaks to that question we were touching on earlier around bias. By trying to remove the individuals from it, it changes the flavour of how we consume it. Similarly with ownership, I'm not going to go on about that too much, but I would finish on another aspect, and I think this is an opportunity looking forward, and I was really excited to see Sarah's work earlier on this morning, but this is to do with the particular affordances of some of the digital content, and it's the network of the Laocoon. It's this idea that what we've produced actually fits in a giant network of other Laocoons. There's an image there from Sketchfab. There's about 50 or so digital versions. There's literally hundreds of plaster casts around the world. There's a whole range of really interesting pre-existing creative responses around the Laocoon. Here's one of my favorite, which is Tyler and Hammond's production of the Laocoon as the skeletons. So one of the things you can do with the digital is stop it from being an isolated system, stop it from just being a thing on its own, and start integrating it into these broader networks. So we started in this talk, I think, with communities as networks involved in the production, and then we went on to think about the communities of interest around something like the Macintosh. I just think it's a really interesting area to look at these broader communities out there and how we can instantiate them inside a digital object. itself. I'll leave it there if that's all right.
Thank you so much, Stuart. It's absolutely fascinating. I mean, it's still heartbreaking to see that picture of the art school up in flames, but actually, yeah, a wonderful presentation about such an important object, and it's fascinating. Please put questions or comments in the chat, and we'll pick them up at the end of the session. But I'm going to move on now to Lorraine, Dr. Lorraine Clark, who's design researcher and lecturer in HCI at the School of Computer Science at the University of St Andrews. As you can tell from the wall behind her, Lorraine is indeed a designer. That's the idea wall. And she's going to talk about interactives in museum settings. You can just
Sorry, Ian, I am actually having an issue with my PowerPoint, even though I went through this. So just 1 second. My apologies.
No, you're fine, you're fine.
Of course, there'll be one, won't there? So we'll start again.
While we're waiting for this, can I fire a very quick question to Stuart about the Laocoon project? Ian, would that be okay?
Yes, yeah.
Lorraine, let us know and I'll just make it quick. It was just a practical one, Stuart, apart from the really interesting ones we can talk about later. I was thinking that this has so much potential, but also at the back of our minds is always the COVID specter, the C word. And I was thinking it has a lot of potential, as with all the activity this last year. It has pushed institutions to engage more interesting ways digitally, but also have brought up a lot of the issues and problems, because as with everything, it's not an easy panacea for everything. And there's a lot of thought that needs to go into this. I was wondering whether in the project you're working now, looking into the stuff in the near future about how you might use that with different groups, some of the special interest ones you talked about, but maybe different users as well.
So 2 quick points on that, Maria. Thanks a lot. The first one is that slightly counter to some of the optimism that was being expressed in the previous session about people's response to COVID. I have a sense that not all responses to it have actually been that thoughtful. There's been a kind of rush online, and there's a rush to the digital. And while there's obviously been some outstanding stuff when we saw some of it earlier, there's a lot of it that actually kind of takes us backwards a little bit, to be honest with you, because it was seen as we must replace our visitor experience with something online, and it's all been done, frankly, in a little bit of a rush. The other, I'm not going to give specific examples. The other point I'd make about that is that clearly headsets, are a vector of infection, and they always have been, in actual fact, a vector of infection. Something like the digital Laocoon, essentially, this is conceived as a kind of multimodal object. So you build it so it's capable of being delivered via an immersive system like that. But there's also versions that are available with an AR trigger. For example, you may have seen we have a 3D print of the Laocoon, which acts as an AR trigger for an AR version of that experience, and it can be recast in multiple ways. So the relationship between people's experience of, there's obviously a very intimate and complicated relationship between people's experience of the digital object and its means of delivery, but underpinning it all is what was conceived as a single high quality version from which other versions can be manufactured.
I think this is a very nice point back to Lorraine's talk about the intimate and different multiple ways people experience the digital, because it's the focus on the social interaction, I think, in her talk. Are you okay to go? Maybe Ian will share the slides.
I think, yeah, Ian's going to share the slides. My apologies.
Not at all, not at all. I'm going to share this, and Lorraine, you just tell me when you want to move on.
Great.
But thank you, Stuart. That's a really interesting point. I think we'll come back to how do different people experience this and the multimodality of these things that we're creating.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a bit about the social experience that people have in a museum while they're interacting with hands-on interactive museum exhibits. And if we go back and think about the different motivations for why we actually visit museums, often it can be maybe we're tourists somewhere, or we want to learn about something. There's something in particular you want to see in the exhibition. We want to connect with the past. But also a lot of the time we visit with other people, and there's a social aspect that we want to go to the museum or a cultural heritage venue or site to actually spend time together and have a day out together. So Debonetti argues that there should be both introspective personal experiences and shared experiences in cultural heritage venues, so to allow for consolidating bonds. So I'm kind of questioning, well, how does technology play a role in that social experience? So if you could go to the next slide, Ian. So some of the challenges that we have identified in that area are simply allowing a number of people to actually interact with exhibits can be difficult. But then at the same time, people often engage in their own personal interaction with that exhibit. And this can be a barrier then to intragroup interaction, human to human interaction while they're using the exhibit. So looking at ways to involve people beyond observing and participating in different ways together. So then the next slide.
Sorry.
That's okay. So it's really questioning, where does the immersive technology fit in here? So I'm taking the broad view of what is immersive. I think that's what you were discussing when I was trying to get my slides together. And thinking about it really from immersive activities and experiences from the visitor's point of view, and not necessarily defining it from the technology point of view. So I'm going to talk, look at two in particular exhibits that we researched visitors' interactions at, and these were in the Riverside Transport Museum. So it was the firefighter exhibit and the Glenn Douglas exhibit. And both of these exhibits have a lot in common. So they were both task-based activities. They were supporting multiple people interacting at the same time. They had several physical controllers, and they supported tangible interaction. So we'll just have a look at the first one, which was the firefighter installation. And at this exhibit, you were invited to put out fires that appeared on the different buildings in front of you. And to do this, you needed to move the ladder. So there was a controller at the bottom of the ladder, a tiller wheel, which would turn the ladder physically in the space. And then at the top of the ladder, there was a hose that another person could press to put out the fire, and then water would appear on the building in front of you. So the second exhibit then was the Glenn Douglas. This is a little bit hard to see because it's not animated now. So basically, there has two different stations at the Glenn Douglas, and the idea is to get the steam locomotive running. So at the first station on the left, which is behind the warning sign, you had a controller to add coal and water. And then at the other end, the pressure would build up, and there was a pressure lever where you could release the pressure, and then the steam locomotive would start running, which was represented by a mechanical model at the end on the right. But while all of this was going on, information about how much coal and water to add were shown on screens 2 and 3, which were located away from those controllers, which was at station 1 on the left side of the exhibit. So what we saw, the next slide. So what we saw was that people were really immersed in the activities at these, completely engaged in what they were doing. But at the same time, they were also engaged in collaborative social interactions while using these exhibits. So looking at exactly what those interactions were, next slide again. People were really coordinating their actions, and in particular, they were coordinating in a way that they were relying on each other. So in this image here, there's a child on the right who's reading out the information on screen 2, and then passing it to the child that's at station 1. So they were listening out and acting upon what another person was saying. And then the next slide, please. So similarly at the other exhibit as well, at different points when the fires would appear in the window, the child that was at the top of the ladder would turn back and focus their attention on the person at the tiller wheel, asking them to interact with the controllers they have. so they can then put the fire out. So then it's the next slide. So it's really looking at these social interactions that happened here. And we argued that these were underpinned by a distribution of control, by separating that interaction out among people. And it was done in a way that led to alternating sequential interaction. So they weren't focusing only on their own interaction, but relying on others and focusing beyond themselves. So in this way, I kind of think about that they're immersed in the social activity and also the activity at the exhibit. So then thinking about how can such social activities be facilitated and encouraged while using immersive technologies, which I think Sophia mentioned earlier on as well. So one of the other projects that I've worked on, which was a large 4-year EU project, and it was called MESH, and it was about material encounters with digital cultural heritage, and also about allowing curators to be able to kind of curate the content for the digital exhibits. So the two exhibits that I'm going to focus on are the Loop and then the Atlantic Wall. So you can just see different images of them here. So first of all, the Loop was a device that was created to kind of allow people to explore the exhibitions almost with a magnifying glass, going around and inspecting the different artifacts. And when they were doing that, then they were able to see on the device overlaid content, digital content that had a variety of text-based information, animations, and kind of these outlines to encourage people to kind of zoom in on those artifacts. So in this way, we're kind of seeing that there's a focus towards the artifact away from, even though it's through a screen, but it is also focusing on the artifact too. So looking at the social aspect of this as well, we observed that people were sharing the controllers if there was one controller between people. So they're actually using them together and exploring together over the shoulders of each other. I think. So this reminds me of another example, which is not in the MESH project, which is gyroscopes. And this was created by Art and Com, and it's in the Museum of Natural History in Berlin. So what this is augmented reality showing the dinosaur skeletons in front of the visitors come to life. So at the installation, there was these kind of periscopes, which they're called gyroscopes, to look through and see the skeletons then come to life. But there was also a large screen where you could see this as well, so multiple people were able to see it. And then if you go to the next slide, it should show this transformation as it would happen for people. So they would see it then go into a natural environment. So the interactions that were observed at this exhibit were studied by Hornecker. And what she found was that people were indexing, going back and forth between the digital content in front of them and the real artifact that was in the museum. But as well as that, with the social engagement element of that, looking at the different, the large screen that was there for people, that was observed more where people have the resource that's shared together and they can point to together. So I kind of have that question semi-immersive, or maybe it's semi-virtual, where it's like that connection and not completely removing people from what's in front of them and also from the other people around them. So the next one, you'll have to be careful with time for me, I'm afraid. So the next installation is the Atlantic Wall exhibition, and that's in Museon in The Hague. And this was part of MESH as well. So I'm going to talk a bit about replica artifacts that were used in this. So the way that the exhibition worked, if you just go to the next slide, was that there was 10 different stations around the exhibition where you could go and listen to different stories, people's personal accounts of that time. So the Atlantic Wall was a wall that was built along the coastal front in Central Europe by the Nazis, and it went through The Hague. So parts of it are still there in The Hague as well. So this was an exhibition about that. And going around the exhibition, people could use these replica artifacts to listen to different perspectives. So there was, at the start of the exhibition, there was 6 replicas where people could choose from one or more of them to listen to as they're going around the exhibition. So the 6 replicas represented 2 languages, and then 3 different perspectives. So the civilian, the German soldier, or the civil servant perspective. So what we observed when people were choosing these replicas was a way of kind of immersing themselves in actually exploring them, but also choosing what they want to use and figuring out how to use it. So what I'm interested here in is that the sensory exploration that people had, picking up almost all of the replicas, feeling and touching them, looking at them, the different sides of them, showing them to other people and having conversations with people about them. And the other aspect is that people were really immersed in the different perspectives as well, not just one perspective, not absolutely everybody, but we could see from the participants that we interviewed that filled out questionnaires that 64 of the participants said that they used 104 replicas. So people were using more than and listening to more than one perspective. So thinking about different reflections on these immersive technologies and experiences and how it relates to my field, it's really, I guess I'm coming from the human-computer interaction side of it and focusing on that user experience. So I'm interested in the storytelling aspect and the experiential side of it for the visitors. And here I'm thinking about questioning what is an immersive experience and the interactions that we have with immersive technologies or just technologies in general. So that difference between our engagement in a sensory way with physical replicas of artifacts, being immersed in the activity, which really relates to the theory of flow, being engaged in social interaction at the same time, and then questioning that semi-immersive kind of area. So this has kind of made me think about where immersive technology kind of lies in the aspect of, I guess, from a telling, showing experience and interacting point of view. So telling being like being told a story, whether that's through text or audio, but showing in a visual way, and then experiencing maybe being in that situation or enacting a situation either, and then interacting, how people actually engage with that digital content. So where does immersive kind of sit here, I suppose? And thinking about the social interactions that can happen with those immersive technologies. So a few kind of reflections or lessons learned, I guess, that there's just so many agendas and expectations of these different technologies that we use from lots of different stakeholders, I guess, and from the visitors. And I think there's a real balancing act there, you know, between the content and the story focus and the user experience and the interaction focus. And I think that, yes, it's just the balancing act there. Another thing is thinking about what's being evaluated, like what is a successful interactive exhibit. Does like success, like that term is really loaded, but it is just thinking about what we're actually evaluating and questioning. And then thinking about the one size fits all. I've seen that a few times, like to kind of have a template that you can put different content in, but what is it should be aiming for? Should every experience be unique, and how can you make it unique? And obviously a lot of you are really aware of the demand that content generation in particular for like any visual content or animation. So just my closing thought on it really is, how can immersive technology in cultural heritage sector better support visitors' social interactions? That's it.
Thank you so much. There's a lot in there. Great. Thank you very, very much. And we've already got some questions coming up in the chat, so we'll pick these up at the end. But please do keep the questions coming. I'm already starting to see lots of themes, particularly related to what we heard in the first set of presentations as well. I'm just going to plow on to Chris Rowland, who's a professor at the Duncan of Jordanson College of Art and Design at Dundee, where he leads the 3D Visualization Research Lab. And Chris is going to talk about the Fallen Oak, visualizing HMS Royal Oak after 80 years underwater. It's a kind of very novel and very interesting thing. Chris, are you able to share your screen? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Do we have that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, so the focus of my research is on the 3D visualization of subsea environments. These are most often historic or hazardous shipwrecks. There's sometimes aircraft that have been lost at sea, and occasionally oil and gas installations. My interest is very much in the aircraft and shipwrecks kind of area. And since 2005, where I really started getting into this through my PhD, we've recorded over 300 sites, mainly for historic reasons worldwide. I'm going to focus on just one of them because it's very recent for us, and it's also one of the most challenging that we've taken on. So we're going to look at the work that we did for the 80th anniversary of the sinking of HMS Royal Oak at Scapa Flow, sunk in 1939. So most of this work was carried out during 2019, but continued through last year, 2020. So one of the questions that Maria specifically said is, try and talk about why we're using immersive technology. So I've going to take that really quite literally. In our case, we're dealing with very remote hazardous environments that they're inaccessible to most people, and usually inaccessible to our research team as well. We just get licensed to have access for a certain period of time. And in this case, it's protected by law. So other divers are not allowed on this site in Orkney. It's a war grave, and it's full of munitions, live munitions that were on board when it was sunk. In the augmented reality area, which we'll touch on, some of the artifacts recovered from these wrecks are pretty fragile, and handling or displaying them can cause damage. So using 3D scans allows us to interrogate those a little bit without further contamination. And another reason for the scanning is that quite often the museums, and we've been dealing a lot with Stromness Museum and Kirkwall Museum, they're quite small spaces, and they don't have the space to display every artifact, which I think is probably common in most museums. Additional point, as a kind of method, we capture data at the highest resolution that we can achieve at the time. So that's limited to budget and what's available. But generally, we go for higher resolution, even though we might not be able to process all of that, particularly in 3D using structure from motion at the time. But we can certainly downsize it to use the technology we've got. But since we started doing this, the technology has improved so much that data we captured back in the first 10 years of this century, we're now able to reprocess and get high resolution results from it. And the other thing is, you may not get an opportunity to revisit a site, so it's important you get as much as you can while you're there. So a little bit of history. I'll try and keep this brief because I want to get onto the pictures. Royal Oak was first laid down in 1916. Fought in World War I, particularly the Battle of Jutland, and it's a big ship. It's 189 meters long. So even compared to modern day warships, Royal Oak was pretty big. There were some structural changes took place in 1935. You can see on this picture on the side of the hull where there's a bulge that kind of sticks out a little bit out of the water. Those are torpedo bulges, and they're meant to stop the penetration of torpedoes through the side to sink the ship. This didn't work for Royal Oak, unfortunately, because on the 14th of October, late night, the ship was sunk by U-47, a U-boat, and this was very early part of World War II, start of World War II, basically about 6 weeks in, and there was a huge loss. The ship was sunk by 4 torpedoes, and with a loss of 835 lives. Still one of the biggest ever naval losses in history, British history. Our survey project was meant to capture data from the wreck and basically examine what condition it was in, whether there were any munitions looking like they were going to cause any problems. And to do this, we worked with the Royal Navy Northern Diver Group. Those are the guys in the rib on the picture on the left, and they're basically bomb disposal experts. So very useful people to have around. And then some of our team on the boat on the right, a big collaboration, all voluntary. So this is data that we captured back in 2006 on behalf of the Ministry of Defence. So you can see it's what we call multi-beam sonar data, and this is captured using a device that sends out sonar pings and measures the length of time that an echo takes to get back to the boat on the surface. And the longer the time, the deeper the object. So as you get these corresponding echoes, it builds up a 3D image. And we were pretty at the head of the market at the time. This still is used as data to compare with more recent data sets to see how the ship's changing. Okay. So what we've been doing with the 80th survey is using that base data from 2006 and then adding in structure from motion, because the problem with multi-beam is it's created by sound. It doesn't give you color or texture. Whereas with photogrammetry, we were able to get on site with lots of lighting and high resolution cameras and just capture significant features of the wreck over time. That image is the guy in the middle, or the lower diver. That's my colleague, Kari Huhtinen, who's a pioneer in this kind of underwater photogrammetry technique. And I'm just above him, kind of illuminating the site. If you go, excuse me, the wreck's at 32 meters. If you come 10 meters under the water, you lose all color, all of the color red disappears immediately. So we have to illuminate everything that we're recording. It's a slight difference from carrying out this kind of data capture on land, where generally daylight is giving you lots of information. Comparing the multi-beam sonar, this is an image. I hope it's clear. It's just little dots in space. It's a point cloud. And it shows you the A turret and B turret sections. These are near the bow. Now the ship's upside down, as you saw from the other image. And the whole of that data set for the multi-beam data, including the seabed, is 1.5 million points. When we went back with the photogrammetry, this is a turret with the photogrammetry with a little diver image to give you a sense of scale. That's 35 million points just for a turret. So quite a significant increase in fidelity. And as you can see, we've managed to capture pretty much all the color and fine detail that the multi-beam just misses out. If you just compare those two, if you look around the seabed, there's a few little lumps there, but you can't tell what they are. And then with the photogrammetry, it's clear what they are. These items on the right-hand side have just fallen from the deck over time. So back to the original image. Let me just check something. There we go. And then this is the extent of the photogrammetry data that we've processed so far. So we got quite a lot of it done during 2019, and we put that into a documentary about the project, which kind of tells the story of the Royal Oak, but also tells the story of some of the survivors and some of the witnesses to the sinking. And the whole point of the project was to reveal all of this to people who will never get to see it, which is most of the population. So again, comparing the data, as I said before, it's 1.5 million points for the multi-beam data, and that extent of photogrammetry data you can see there is 230 million. So quite heavy duty. This is the reverse side, this is the starboard side, and you can see the 4 torpedo holes. So looking from the left, that was the first hit at the bow. The second hit just missed the ammunition store. if that had been hit directly, the whole ship would have been fragmented with even further loss of life. And then third and fourth hits are pretty much midships as the ship's rolled over. What we did with that data is we took it to the local communities, and we started off running workshops with school children. So the approach we took was, for this use of the data, we wanted to give the pupils a sense of what it felt like to dive on the ship. So the data itself is pretty agnostic. It doesn't know what you're going to do with it. We've used a lot of it for animation, for the documentary that we made, and also for just online sharing the data. But we specifically made a couple of projects where you could explore this, and the controller in the girl's hand on the left-hand image, she's using that as a torch. So she can point it at different points in the wreck as she moves around, and it illuminates that area. So it's very much like we were capturing the data in the same method. And then she can jump to different points. You can hold in your left hand a small model of a virtual model of the wreck, and you can point at a different section, and that transports you to, say, the third turret or the midships area or the torpedo area. We also captured a lot of 360 video around the wreck. So the two students on the right-hand side are using much kind of consumer level headsets, and they're just looking around the turret. And we had a lot of interlopers when we were shooting the 360 video. There are two seal pups that are resident on the wreck, and they seem to like the lights. So as soon as we set up the 360 camera and put the lighting around it, these seal pups would start photobombing. The girl in the pink jumper has just turned around as the seal swam past her. So we had lots of little additional immersive experiences that we didn't expect. Those were the younger end of the people experiencing the workshops. This is, on the left, is a chap called Johnny Meal, who witnessed the sinking of the ship. In fact, he says he witnesses it, but he was about 11 years old, and it sank at 11 o'clock at night. But his house was where he was born, where he lived his whole life, and unfortunately died in mid-2020. He'd gone to bed. So when he went to bed, the ship was there, all lit up. When he got up the next morning, it was gone. It sunk overnight. So he does embellish the stories a little bit, but he's a lovely guy. And any documentary you see on the HMS Royal Oak, there's an interview with Johnny, including ours. And we dedicated the film to him because he died just before we finished and released it. On the right-hand side, we've got another group of people who are politicians. So we managed to go and show the immersive experiences of HMS Royal Oak with the museum sector presentations at Holyrood. And on that purple table, or purple covered table, there's a little bit that says SMS Mark Graph. And that's another one of our little projects where articles were stolen from the wreck of the Mark Graph, which is a German wreck from World War I in Orkney, were recovered by the police, given to HES for conservation, and HES came to us to look at scanning them as a kind of digital archive, because they were deteriorating rapidly. They've been in the water for almost 100 years. As soon as they're brought out into the air, they start falling to pieces. So we were doing like quick capture, and that's my colleague, Alice Watterson, who did all the 3D scanning for that. So we put these into an augmented reality enhanced book, which we call a PopUp Book, a 3D PopUp Book. And here's a couple of the pages. So you use standard AR, you use a tablet or a smartphone with a little key image, and then this will pop up the object. So on the left-hand side, you're seeing one of the ship's telephones, and on the right-hand side, you're seeing some of the sailors below decks would wear around their chests. So this is actually the first hands-free phone. It's got a little mouthpiece, and so they could continue doing their work and have a headset on, so they could hear the message from upstairs or above deck, and then speak into this mouthpiece without having to take their hands off it. So I would demonstrate this, but this is my only copy of it, and it's just been sent off for ref I'm not sure everybody else has experienced that kind of thing. The other augmented reality work we did with Stromness Museum was about the SCAP 100 project, which included the Royal Oak stuff that I just shown you. So this was 4 panels that were installed at the entrance to the museum, as you can see on the left-hand side, and then re-shown in the AHRC event, which you can see on the right. So the image, if you look on the left, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but there's a little image of the multi-beam of Royal Oak, and then a little key sticker on there. And if you point to your device using the Zapper app, then the animation of that ship would pop out just in front of the the panel. And there were 6 other artifacts presented like that. So there's lots of different things from different periods of time represented as AR in there. And so lessons learned. These are more kind of obvious takeaways, but I thought I'd go obvious. Just repeating, capture the best or the highest quality data that you can, because you might not get back, and you might want to retask it for something a bit more higher resolution as the technology improves. Archiving is a bane to all of us, because the demands of AHRC and others for having digital archives are change at a whim. The reason I put archiving in is when we were week 8 into the Royal Oak project on site, we were processing data overnight, then getting out on the boat the next day. On one Saturday night, while we were asleep upstairs and our kit was processing and uploading in the kitchen table, we were burgled, and we lost a laptop, and we lost some lights, and we lost 4 hard drives that were in the process of backing up. So we lost just over 2 weeks' work in one night. And I don't know what else we could have done other than just sleep in the kitchen and have shotguns ready. We managed to catch up basically because the Ministry of Defence extended our license by 3 weeks, so we could go back in November and recapture that data. But if we hadn't got that permission, we would have lost a whole chunk of data. The other thing about archiving I've found, since still working on the data a little while later, is that once you're backing everything up, make sure that your naming conventions make sense. Because if you're looking at somebody else's data a year later and they haven't stuck to the same naming conventions for your source data, that is an absolute pain. The other thing, which I think is really is definitely in terms of PhD practice, whatever you're doing, be playful with your data, be playful with your capture approach. Because even though some of us have been doing this for donkey's years, we still are able to learn from every project. We learn something new and we go, well, let's try it this way. Let's try it with different lighting. Let's try it with 4 people lighting on 3 cameras in alignment and all these kind of things. We try something new every time. Sometimes it doesn't work. And as a few people already said, that's not failure. That's a scientific method. So be prepared to just think about, are you just following what everybody else has done? Take a few risks and see what happens. And also the last point I want to make, and I think this has been said a few times as well, consider what story you're trying to tell with your visualization, with your immersive experience. What's the story and who are you telling it to? Is it to other practitioners and researchers, or is it to those school kids at a secondary school, or is it to the general public who have a historical interest or potentially future interest in what you're doing? So those are kind of obvious, but I don't mind stating the obvious now and again. The last thing I'll say, I think I'm not more than a minute over. Our documentary is on Vimeo. We launched it just about the 80th anniversary project. It's about 25-26 minutes long at the moment. We've had about 11,000 views so far. But I'd really like you to go and have a look at it. It gives a lot more detail. It's a lot of talking about the basics of structure for emotion for a general audience. And there's some great interviews in there and some lovely footage from my colleagues. So that, I think, is me. Other than one other point, I can plug a TV program on Monday evening at 9 o'clock on More 4, and it's about the world's greatest shipwrecks and some of our work on HMS Vanguard and HMS Hampshire is included in that first program. So that's me.
That's great. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you, all the speakers. And my head is buzzing with so many concepts around different interpretations of immersive and issues of representation and truth and so on. We already started the discussion period a bit after Stuart's presentation, but I know you won't mind if we eat into the lunch break a little bit, just so we can benefit from the expertise and the insight of our panel members. Please put questions in the chat if you have them. I have loads, and I'm going to ask them all unless you ask them. We're going to start with Lisa's asked question. What process do projects use to explore or direct an audience's focus to highlighting things? And particularly asking about the kind of dominance of visual perception over other perception. So maybe I'm just going to go to each of in turn when thinking about, you know, trying to point an audience to particular things in an object or representation. What kind of processes do you use to think about how to direct an audience's attention, if at all? Stuart, maybe start with you.
Thanks. Well, again, just a couple of brief points in that. One is that from my personal experience and also in talking to other people, the idea of like simple free roaming environments are actually not very effective. People find they actually relish a bit of direction. And in the digital Laocoon project, I have to say that gaze activation was a bit of a revelation for me, because so basically as people are looking around the object, their gaze is being tracked and things can pop up. They don't necessarily have to trigger that, but they can see it's there. So they very quickly get a sense that this is a rich object. There's a lot associated with it. So it's a kind of, it's interesting actually. It relates to the question that Sarah Kenderdine raised and Rachel also raised about search engines, about means of discovery. But I was a big fan of gaze activation. The only other thing I would say is that with regard to visual domination, this is like a really hot topic right now, and people are very, very interested in other senses, embodied experience, and particularly sound and spatialized sound. And the other immersive I was going to talk about, but obviously didn't really have time today, is a project around Staffa, which uses acoustic modeling of a site that has very famously got a strange acoustic resonance, but again using that with creative response. So in that project we were commissioning music which was played using the convolution derived from the acoustic model. So there's a whole layer of veracity associated with the sound quality as well as with the visual.
Thank you very much. Lorraine, maybe we can turn to you, because a lot of your work has been around, you know, processes or guiding people through a narrative. So what's the balance there in terms of kind of free-form explanation or guiding people to what you want them to look at?
I think like the Atlantic Wall exhibition that I showed, they really planned out like a route kind of for people to go through, and you definitely could like not go with that route if you wanted. It was quite an open space, but there was kind of the platforms, these stations, I guess physically were kind of creating barriers in the exhibition space to kind of guide people along as well. But thinking about like guiding people to look at the artifacts, I guess, and kind of get away from the screen. Like I think like the Glenn Douglas and the firefighter one, like people are so immersed in the interaction that looking at the real artifact doesn't really happen at that moment, but might happen later. But that's not something I studied, but it is definitely a challenge, like with all of these kind of agendas, to try and direct that. And it was something the museum were quite interested in. Interestingly, like with the loop one, I know that from some of the surveys, the questionnaires with that, even though people were looking at the artifacts, the feedback was that it distracted people from the artifacts.
Right, I'm going to ask you about that in a minute if nobody else asks the question first. I'm going to pass on to Chris first. Chris, I imagine that a lot of the people who are maybe looking at your representations maybe don't know how to read a battleship, if you know what I mean, or to know what's interesting. So do you use any particular techniques then to guide people to what you might think is interesting to look at?
We definitely are. We're working on that just now. We're collaborating with a group in Helsinki called Tea Time Research, who are kind of specialists in dealing with the kind of data that we produce. So we're looking at how you build a starting narrative to allow people to explore with the immersive stuff. I think in terms of the pop-up book, we're using books. You know, it's like you open it, you start on page 1 usually. And then you flip the page. So people are working through those, and it's quite an easy thing to do. So then the narrative structure is just in the form of the book. And I'd say the same thing with the interactive panels, that there's a timeline that runs across from the start of World War I through to present day divers on the wrecks. And in between that, you've got salvage and start of World War II and how Orkney's played its role in that. So you do very much follow a traditional left to right. And then you get to the points wherever you see a blue sticker, you know, you can have another look and see some of the data, video footage from deep inside the wrecks, which is not a place many people want to go, but also things like the 3D scans of the artifacts will pop up in front of the screen, so you get a much better sense of them. So I think we're not really breaking any new ground there. We're adopting methods of simple narrative that anybody can pick up quickly. It's much more difficult, I think, in the immersive, you know, the full VR. And we've found at the moment that the Doll's House have not hand-sized mini version of the model, which you can look at very quickly and go, I want to look at that. And what we're planning to do is have layers of information into that, so that can turn into, if you point at a turret, it will show you what a turret looked like on deck with sailors next to it, so it becomes a photograph. And then if you move your finger away, it goes back to the 3D model. So we're looking at layering things like that in. So if you're interested in the guns, they're easy to find using that Doll's House. But we need to explore with it and get it out there a little bit more and test.
Great question. And just while you're there, Chris, because I've got a question from Shona about how did you find the process and outcome of creating the documentary for communicating your research compared to kind of the usual methods of public engagement and dissemination?
It was a breath of fresh air. It really was. It gave us the opportunity. Well, the reason we did it is because in 2 other projects I've worked on, which are now in this documentary that goes out on Monday, 9 o'clock before. But we've had film companies come up and interview us, and we've had the BBC interview while we're on site, and then they put their own take on it. And we didn't want this to happen with the Royal Oak because we were all a very passionate team. We followed the kind of what we call putting the team together. We followed the Nina principle. Have you come across that?
No.
It's no egos, no assholes. Right. So we have that process, I think, and I stick to that when we're trying to put a team together. So everybody was there's a total sense of everybody's contribution was really important to the project. So that included like colleagues like Alice Watson and Kieran Baxter involved in the documentary process. We came out of the water, they would interview us immediately what our emotional response was. You know, we've just seen human remains and all sorts of stuff on the seabed, and then, you know, masses of munitions. To capture that, we needed to do that ourselves. So we've been bitten before, decided that the best way to document the event was to do it ourselves. Then we commissioned a colleague of ours to become the director to put it together. And within that, I kind of, as a producer, I just said, we've got to tell what the research story is. So we have to tell how we're capturing this, what we found out about the process, and how we can communicate that to a much wider audience. So I would recommend it if you've got filmmakers on your team, just use them, get them involved. It's what they do. And that really helps communicate the story. I found Kieran asking me questions made me much more not like I am being now, much more clear in my answers. But he'd say, I don't understand what that means. Tell me what that means, as if I'm a granny.
Yeah.
You actually become much more lucid and articulate.
You're coming with so many catchphrases. I'm going to put these in t-shirts. Especially the respect the naming conventions. That should be cast in stone. I'm going to ask a question. I'm maybe going to aim this at Stuart first. This is based on a discussion we were having with Thea and Maria, who were putting together the event. A lot of researchers and maybe some of the PhD students are interested in kind of historical contextualization and using kind of immersives to excavate new knowledge. But obviously there's a process there of representations. So how do you select what to include and what you don't? And it's a kind of bulky.
I was a mute deliberately there. Yeah. Well, that's a really open question, isn't it? I mean, the first thing I'd say is that, again, echoing a point that Rachel and others have made earlier on today, is one of the unique affordances of the digital, including immersives, is the fact that you can have multiple layers of interpretation, multiple layers of competing interpretations, lots of different voices expressed. So in theory, you can pile all that in there, so you don't have to make those choices. If the material's there, you can put it in there. In practice, for most projects, there tends to be too much, or there's constraints regarding time, constraints regarding money, and so on. So I think I mean, it sounds like a traditional approach, but it works. Once you make your decisions about what stories you're going to tell, you can bring in domain experts to guide you. And a good domain expert will point out where the areas of contention are, so not necessarily grind their own axe. So I think it might be a traditional approach, but I think if you've got the right expert, it works pretty well.
Thank you. Okay, we're easy into lunchtime. I'm going to ask maybe just one final question, and I'll give each of you a chance to respond. You're all coming from different backgrounds and with different experiences, but I think you're all you're all experts, and you're all very successful in your own areas. So I'm just thinking, for the PhD students who are joining us today, what kind of, I'd maybe ask you to forecast a bit, what kind of skills do you think you need to be successful in this area? If you were just thinking about developing skills as a student, to work in this sector in the future, what kind of skills do you think are most useful? Maybe go to Lorraine first and just throw it at you and see how you respond.
It's a difficult one because I think it's so broad. Like, as in, like, even with all of us here, I think there's quite a range of skill sets and angles to come at the topic from. On a personal level, I think it's about being open, and like all of these different perspectives have so much value, and people are really passionate from whatever angle they're talking about. Like, if I feel like we're almost advocates of a certain perspective, whether that's trying to really recreate or bring something to life that is from history, or create a certain experience for the visitor. So I think it's really being open to that, and when maybe that's a social skill rather than well, it is something we learn and we develop, but rather than kind of an academic skill, I guess. But
I think still one we can practice. I think it's a very good answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to throw over to you then. I mean, what kind of skills or attributes you think are useful for working in this area?
Was that for me?
Yes, please.
Oh, sorry, I missed that one. I think following on from what Lorraine said, one of the critical things is filtering the advice you get, because everybody in their own mind, their subject area and their position on it is the way to go, and you're going to get that. You're going to get conflicting views. So being completely open-minded is great, but then filter. And don't be afraid of disagreeing with people. And I would say contentiously, even your supervisors, because it's your PhD, it's your story you're trying to tell. And as long as you've worked out what that story is and where it fits into your academy, then you're on a winner. And the last thing I would say is, don't be discouraged. There's about 2/3 of the way through. everybody hits a wall.
Yeah.
So I swam under mine. But be aware, everybody gets that.
Thank you. Okay, maybe finish up with Stuart then. Do you have any kind of insight or advice for our PhD students?
I'm just going to kind of echo the advice that's already been given there, especially Lorraine's there about working with other people. I think that developing an ability to collaborate is absolutely key, because it's such a big domain that you're not going to be expert in everything, and you're going to have to work and get advice. I mean, that as a professional skill, absolutely. I think Chrissy's point, and I'm really pleased to see him raise it there about data management and data archiving. You know, if you get that right as a skill, you can save yourself an awful lot of heartache going forward. And I'll just finish on a kind of quite a strange one, because I've been having practitioner lecturers in at the GSA, and we kind of asked them a similar question. And a real theme is that emerged this year. And it's not about what skills should you learn. When we're asking, they say one thing you shouldn't do: don't become obsessed with a particular piece of software. You feel that you're achieving something, you feel that you're learning something, but this area changes so quickly that actually in the long run, becoming like the world's expert in one piece of commercial software isn't necessarily what you want to be doing.
Thank you so much, and it's great. Right? And I think it's clear from all your presentations how many different people we interact with when we're doing a project, and then in this year, and that's actually some of the most rewarding aspects of it. So thank you all for the great presentations and for the advice. Thank you so much. Okay,